I never thought sorting through my deceased uncle's belongings would uncover a secret that would shake our entire family to its core. Uncle Martin had always been the mysterious one in our family. Successful, wealthy, but oddly private about his personal life. When he passed away last month at 62, I volunteered to help clean out his downtown apartment, expecting to find the typical remnants of a bachelor's life. What I found instead changed everything I thought I knew about our family. It started innocently enough. I was going through his desk drawers when I stumbled upon a second wallet hidden behind a false panel. Inside were identification documents, credit cards, and a driver's license, all bearing Uncle Martin's photograph, but with a completely different name, David Richardson. The address listed was across town, in a neighborhood I'd never known him to frequent. My hands trembled as I examined the documents. They weren't fake. The quality, the official seals, everything appeared legitimate. But how could my uncle have two complete identities? I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at these documents, my mind racing with questions that seemed impossible to answer. The more I searched through his apartment, the more evidence I found of this double life. There were 2 sets of car keys, 2 different gym memberships, even 2 separate cell phones hidden in different drawers. One phone contained contacts I recognized, family members, colleagues from his accounting firm, old college friends. The other phone was filled with numbers I'd never seen before, under names that meant nothing to me. But it was the discovery of a small key taped under his bathroom sink that really sent chills down my spine. Attached to it was a piece of paper with an address I didn't recognize and the words, "Emergency only," written in Uncle Martin's distinctive handwriting. I knew I should probably contact the police, or at least tell my parents about what I'd found. But something held me back. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the nagging feeling that this secret was bigger than just a case of identity fraud. Whatever it was, I decided I needed to understand what my uncle had been hiding before involving anyone else. That evening, I drove to the address written on the piece of paper. It led me to a storage unit facility on the outskirts of town. Unit 247 was small and nondescript, tucked away in a corner of the complex where the lighting was dim and security cameras seemed strategically absent. My heart pounded as I inserted the key into the lock. The metal door rolled up with a rusty groan, and I peered inside using my phone's flashlight. What I saw made my blood run cold. The storage unit was filled with surveillance equipment, high-end cameras, recording devices, computers, and monitors. But more disturbing were the walls, covered with photographs and documents that appeared to chronicle the lives of various people. Some faces I recognized as distant relatives, others were complete strangers. There were detailed notes about daily routines, family relationships, financial information, and personal secrets that no outsider should have known. In the center of it all was a large corkboard with our family tree meticulously mapped out, going back 4 generations. Each family member had a file attached with their photo, and red strings connected different individuals in a web that I couldn't immediately understand. But what terrified me most was seeing my own photograph pinned prominently at the center, with the word "Next" written underneath in red ink. As I stood there, surrounded by evidence of my uncle's secret surveillance operation, I realized that his death might not have been the natural heart attack we'd all assumed. And more frightening still, I began to suspect that whatever he'd been involved in wasn't finished. It was just being passed on to the next generation. Me. I barely slept that night, my mind racing with questions about Uncle Martin's secret life and what the word "next" meant beside my photograph. The next morning, I called in sick to work and returned to the storage unit, determined to piece together the puzzle my uncle had left behind. This time, I brought a laptop and spent hours methodically photographing every document, every photo, every note pinned to those walls. What emerged was a pattern that made my stomach churn. Uncle Martin hadn't just been watching our family, he'd been systematically documenting and manipulating our lives for decades. I found records of anonymous tips that had gotten my cousin Jake fired from his job 3 years ago. There were copies of fake letters that had broken up my Aunt Sarah's marriage, and evidence that he'd been the mysterious buyer who'd outbid my parents on their dream house back in 2018. Every major family conflict, every piece of bad luck, every coincidence that had befallen our relatives over the past 20 years, Uncle Martin's fingerprints were all over it. But why? What could possibly motivate someone to systematically destroy their own family's happiness? The answer came when I found a locked file cabinet hidden behind the surveillance equipment. Inside were legal documents dating back to 1985, the year my grandfather died. Apparently, there had been a contested will, something our family had never been told about. My grandfather had left his entire estate, worth millions, to be divided equally among his children. But there was a clause that changed everything. If any heir died without children, their portion would be redistributed to the surviving siblings. Uncle Martin, who had never married or had children, stood to inherit nothing unless his siblings and their offspring were removed from the equation. The documents revealed a decades-long campaign of psychological warfare designed to drive family members to suicide, into dangerous situations, or simply away from the family entirely. My hands shook as I read through his meticulous notes. He'd been playing the long game, slowly eliminating potential heirs while maintaining his cover as the successful, caring uncle who attended every birthday party and holiday gathering. The irony was sickening. We'd all admired him for his devotion to family, never realizing he was orchestrating our destruction. But there was something else in those files that made my blood run cold. A medical report dated just 3 months before his death, showing that Uncle Martin had been diagnosed with terminal cancer. He'd known he was dying, which meant his plan needed to accelerate. According to his timeline, I was supposed to be the next accident. I found detailed surveillance reports on my daily routine, my job, my relationships. He knew where I lived, where I worked, what route I took to the gym, even what I ordered at my favorite coffee shop. There were notes about my recent breakup with Sarah, my struggles with depression, and what he'd identified as my vulnerability points for manipulation. Most chilling was a folder labeled Final Phase that outlined how my suicide was supposed to look. He'd even written the note he planned to leave behind, describing my supposed guilt over some fabricated financial scandal. Reading my own fake suicide note, written in my uncle's handwriting, was perhaps the most terrifying moment of my life. But Uncle Martin had died before he could execute this final phase of his plan. His heart attack had saved my life, but it had also left me with a horrifying realization. I wasn't the only one in danger. According to the documents, there were still 7 other family members who needed to be eliminated before the inheritance could be claimed. And now that Uncle Martin was dead, someone else would need to continue his work. That's when I found the second cell phone's text message history and discovered the truth that would haunt me forever. Uncle Martin hadn't been working alone. He had a partner, someone who had been helping him orchestrate this family destruction for years. Someone who was very much alive and had been eagerly waiting for instructions on how to proceed after Martin's death. The last text message, sent just hours before Uncle Martin's fatal heart attack, was simple but terrifying. Phase 2 approved. You know what to do. As I sat in that storage unit, surrounded by evidence of my family's systematic persecution, I realized that Uncle Martin's death hadn't ended our nightmare. It had just passed the torch to his accomplice. And I had no idea who among my trusted family members was the real enemy. The paranoia set in immediately. Every family member became a suspect, every conversation felt loaded with hidden meaning, and every gathering seemed like a potential trap. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, and certainly couldn't concentrate on work. How do you function normally when you know someone close to you has been systematically destroying your family for decades? I decided my only option was to investigate each family member secretly, looking for any connection to Uncle Martin's conspiracy. I started with the most obvious suspects, those who had the most to gain financially, but quickly realized that Martin's psychological profile suggested his partner might be motivated by something other than money. My Aunt Jennifer seemed too grief-stricken by Martin's death to be faking it, and her financial situation was stable enough that she didn't need the inheritance. My cousin Marcus had always been close to Martin, but he'd been living in California for the past 5 years, making it difficult for him to execute the local surveillance operations. It was my own mother who first made me suspicious. I'd always known she had a complicated relationship with Uncle Martin. They were twins, and she'd often mentioned feeling like she lived in his shadow. But when I casually brought up some of the coincidences that had befallen our family over the years, her reactions were off. When I mentioned Jake's mysterious firing, she quickly changed the subject. When I brought up Aunt Sarah's divorce, She seemed to know more details than she should have. And when I suggested that our family had experienced an unusual amount of bad luck lately, she became defensive and suggested I was being paranoid. But it was the night I decided to test her that everything became clear. I called my mother and told her I'd found something strange in Uncle Martin's apartment, some documents that suggested he might have had financial problems before he died. I said I was worried about the implications for his estate and asked if she thought I should contact a lawyer. Her response chilled me to the bone. She immediately asked what kind of documents, where I'd found them, and whether I'd shown them to anyone else. When I gave vague answers, she became insistent that I bring them to her house immediately so we could figure out what to do together. Something in her voice, an urgency, almost desperation, made every alarm bell in my head start ringing. I told her I'd bring the documents over the next day and hung up quickly. That night, I didn't go home. Instead, I parked across the street from my apartment and waited. Sure enough, around 2 a.m., I saw a figure trying to break into my building. Even in the darkness, I recognized the familiar silhouette of my own mother. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. My mother, the woman who had raised me, who I'd trusted with my life, had been Uncle Martin's accomplice all along. She was the one who had helped orchestrate decades of family destruction, and now she was trying to eliminate me before I could expose the truth. I sat in my car, watching her struggle with my apartment's security system, and felt my entire worldview collapse. How long had this been going on? Had my childhood been a lie? Had every moment of maternal love been calculated manipulation designed to keep me close enough to monitor and eventually destroy? When she finally gave up and drove away, I followed her at a distance. She didn't go home to my father. Instead, she drove to a 24-hour diner on the other side of town, where she met with someone I couldn't see clearly in the shadows of the parking lot. They talked for about 20 minutes before parting ways. I knew I had to make a choice. I could go to the police with what I'd discovered, but would they believe such an incredible story without more concrete evidence? And could I really have my own mother arrested, knowing it would destroy what was left of my family? Or I could disappear, just like Uncle Martin had clearly intended for me to do. Change my identity, leave town, start over somewhere else and hope that eventually my mother and whoever she was working with would give up the hunt. But as I sat there in that parking lot, watching my mother drive away after her mysterious meeting, I realized there was a third option. One that Uncle Martin himself had shown me the blueprint for. If I was going to survive this, I would need to become like him. I would need to create my own double life, my own secret identity, and my own plan for systematically eliminating the threats to my existence. The hunter was about to become the hunted, but I wasn't going down without a fight. It was time to disappear completely and begin my own campaign of psychological warfare. After all, I'd learned from the best. And I had advantages Uncle Martin never had. I knew exactly who my enemies were, and I had access to all his research, contacts and methods. My mother thought she was closing in on her final target. She had no idea she was about to become prey. Creating a new identity turned out to be easier than I'd imagined, thanks to Uncle Martin's meticulous records. Hidden among his documents were detailed instructions for obtaining fake identification, along with contact information for the underground network he'd used to maintain his double life as David Richardson. Within 2 weeks, I had become Michael Thompson, complete with social security number, driver's license, and even a credit history carefully constructed to appear legitimate. I rented a small apartment across town under this new identity and began the delicate process of maintaining both lives simultaneously. The hardest part wasn't the logistics. It was the emotional toll of pretending everything was normal around my family while knowing that my own mother was actively planning my murder. I had to attend family dinners, make small talk, and act like a loving son, all while documenting her movements and searching for evidence of her next move. My father remained oblivious to everything, which created an additional layer of complexity. Should I warn him that his wife of 35 years was a sociopath? Should I try to protect him, knowing that he might also be a target? Or was he somehow involved too, just better at hiding it? I decided to test him the same way I'd tested my mother. During a casual conversation, I mentioned finding some interesting financial documents in Uncle Martin's apartment and watched his reaction carefully. Unlike my mother, my father seemed genuinely confused and concerned. His suggestion that we should contact the family lawyer seemed sincere, and his body language showed none of the telltale signs of deception I'd learned to recognize. This gave me some relief, but it also meant that my father was in danger. If my mother was willing to eliminate her own son to protect this conspiracy, she certainly wouldn't hesitate to kill her husband if he became a threat. I began following my mother during her Michael Thompson time, documenting her meetings and activities. What I discovered was a sophisticated operation that went far beyond simple murder for inheritance. She'd been running multiple schemes simultaneously: insurance fraud, identity theft, and what appeared to be some kind of human trafficking operation. The inheritance from my grandfather's will had been just the beginning. Over the past 20 years, she and Uncle Martin had been systematically looting the assets of vulnerable family members, elderly relatives, and even strangers who fit certain profiles. They'd been stealing identities, taking out life insurance policies on people without their knowledge, and creating accidents for anyone who became suspicious. My uncle's death had actually been a major setback for their operation, not just because they'd lost a partner, but because he'd been the one with the technical expertise. My mother was struggling to maintain all the different schemes without his help, which explained why she was so desperate to eliminate me quickly. I represented a loose end she couldn't afford to leave untied. But I also discovered something that changed my understanding of the entire situation. In Uncle Martin's most secure files, I found evidence that this conspiracy went back much further than I'd realized. My grandfather's death in 1985 hadn't been natural. It had been the first murder in a campaign that had been orchestrating accidents for family members for nearly 4 decades. My mother and Uncle Martin had killed their own father to access his will, then spent the next 40 years systematically eliminating anyone who might inherit their shares. They'd murdered at least 12 family members over the decades, making each death look like an accident, suicide, or natural cause. I sat in my secret apartment, surrounded by evidence of my family's long history of murder and betrayal, and felt something fundamental shift inside me. The person I'd been, the naive, trusting son who'd volunteered to clean out his uncle's apartment, was gone. In his place was someone harder, colder, and infinitely more dangerous. Because I'd realized something that my mother didn't know, I'd inherited more from Uncle Martin than she could have imagined. Not just his methods and his contacts, but his complete psychological profile of every family member, including her. I knew her weaknesses, her fears, her daily routines, and most importantly, her blind spots. She'd spent so many years focused on being the predator that she'd never considered what it would feel like to become prey. My mother thought she was hunting down the last loose end in a 40-year conspiracy. She had no idea that her intended victim had not only discovered the full scope of her crimes but had also acquired all the tools necessary for revenge. The student was about to surpass the teacher, and the final lesson was going to be delivered in a language she'd understand perfectly. It was time for my mother to learn what it felt like to be systematically stalked, psychologically tormented, and slowly driven toward her own destruction. After all, she'd taught me everything I needed to know about how to make a murder look like an accident. For 3 months, I systematically dismantled my mother's life using every technique Uncle Martin had perfected over 4 decades. I intercepted her communications with her remaining contacts, fed false information to her criminal network, and began the slow process of making her paranoid and unstable. The beauty of my mother's situation was that she couldn't seek help from law enforcement or even legitimate private investigators. Too much of her life was built on criminal activity that she couldn't afford to have examined. She was trapped in the same isolation that she'd imposed on so many of her victims over the years. I watched her grow increasingly desperate as her carefully constructed world began to collapse. Her mysterious meetings became more frequent and agitated. She started making mistakes, taking unnecessary risks, and showing the same signs of psychological pressure that had driven several of her victims to suicide. But it was during one of these surveillance sessions that I discovered the truth that changed everything I thought I knew about our family's dark history. I'd been following her to what I assumed was another meeting with a criminal contact when she led me to the Greenwood Cemetery, to a section I'd never visited before. She walked directly to a grave marker that made my blood run cold: David Martin Richardson, 1962 to 2025. My uncle hadn't died. The man we'd buried, the man whose apartment I'd cleaned out, whose secret life I'd discovered, that had been David Richardson, Uncle Martin's alternate identity. The real Martin was very much alive, and he'd been watching me uncover his elaborate deception for months. I crouched behind a nearby headstone, my mind reeling as the full scope of their plan became clear. Uncle Martin had faked his own death as Martin while maintaining his David Richardson identity. This had served multiple purposes. It had convinced the family that the threat was gone, it had motivated me to investigate and discover the evidence he'd wanted me to find, and most importantly, it had isolated me from any potential allies. Everything I'd discovered in that storage unit had been carefully planted for me to find. The surveillance equipment, the family tree, the word "next" beside my photograph, it had all been designed to make me paranoid, to turn me against my own family, and to push me into becoming exactly what I'd become, a paranoid, isolated individual capable of murder. My mother wasn't Uncle Martin's accomplice, she was his next victim. And I wasn't the intended heir or the target of their conspiracy. I was the weapon Uncle Martin had been crafting to eliminate the final obstacles to his inheritance. As I watched my mother kneel beside David Richardson's grave, placing flowers and speaking in whispered tones, I realized she'd been genuinely grieving for the past 3 months. She'd believed, just as I had, that Uncle Martin was dead. Her suspicious behavior hadn't been that of a co-conspirator trying to cover her tracks. It had been that of a confused, frightened woman who'd noticed that terrible things kept happening to our family and was trying to understand why. The paranoid surveillance I'd conducted had revealed her desperate attempts to investigate the same mysteries I'd been investigating. Her meeting with a mysterious figure in the parking lot had been with a private investigator she'd hired to look into the family's run of bad luck. Her attempt to break into my apartment had been motivated by genuine concern for my safety after I'd mentioned finding suspicious documents. I'd spent months systematically terrorizing my own mother while the real threat had been watching from the shadows, probably laughing at how easily he'd manipulated me into becoming his perfect, unknowing accomplice. That's when I felt the cold metal of a gun barrel pressed against the back of my neck. "Hello, nephew," Uncle Martin's voice whispered behind me. "I have to say, you've exceeded even my expectations. 40 years of careful planning, and you accomplished more psychological damage in 3 months than I'd managed in the previous decade." As he spoke, I watched my mother rise from the grave and turn toward us, her face registering shock and confusion as she saw her supposedly dead brother-in-law holding a gun to her son's head. "The beauty of this moment," Uncle Martin continued, "is that no matter how this ends, I win. Either you kill your mother as you've been planning, thus eliminating my final obstacle while destroying your own sanity, or I kill you both and inherit everything as the sole surviving heir. Either way, 40 years of patient work finally pays off." But Uncle Martin had made one crucial miscalculation. In teaching me to become a predator, he'd also taught me to always have a backup plan. As my mother stood there, finally understanding the scope of the deception that had destroyed our family, I slowly reached into my jacket and activated the recording device I'd been carrying for weeks. Everything Uncle Martin had just confessed was now documented, and it was being automatically uploaded to a secure server that would release the files to law enforcement if I failed to check in within 24 hours. "You're right about one thing, Uncle Martin," I said quietly. "One of us is definitely going to die tonight. But I learned from the very best teacher, someone who showed me that the key to survival is always being 3 steps ahead of your enemies." The final lesson in our family's dark education was about to begin, and for the first time in 40 years, Uncle Martin wasn't the one in control of how the story would end.